Facts indeed. But images of real and unquestionable events can also be manipulated. A superb example of this was the raising of Saddam Hussein's statue in the heart of Baghdad. The American media presented it as a historical event, cheered on by a sea of enthusiastic Iraqis.
There, you've got what I saw. So it's a street with just a few people. And there you have a lot of people, but I think it's less than 100 people. There are a lot of journalists, and there they're about to rush to get images of the statue.
25 years of hatred and rage as they jump up on the statue, trouncing it with anything.
The majority of the men who are present are the drivers and translators for each of the journalists, other people working for them, and a few locals. But it wasn't a mob of Iraqis who came to welcome the Americans.
Everybody who looked at the picture on the internet could see that there were very few people in the square, and that this had to be done by the American Army finally, and that it was essentially staged for the American Army and for the re-election campaign of George Bush. People, by the way, said there was a mini scandal about the soldier putting first the American flag up, and then, oh, I made a mistake, I've got to put the Iraqi flag up. That wasn't a mistake, it was deliberate. They wanted 2 takes for the television commercial that they thought they would be able to run for Bush's re-election campaign. They didn't know whether they would use the Iraqi flag or the American flag or both, but they wanted the choice.
It was well calculated, because American tanks pulled up in front of the statue just as America was waking up. It was Good Morning Baghdad.
Fresh reaction to
In the evening of that same day, a survey by the Washington Post for ABC News proved that the manipulation had been successful. The percentage of people in favor of the war suddenly rose by 12%.
Number is up to 81%.
So this was a stage for TV, a fake event. And yet everybody reported it as though there was tremendous enthusiasm and that mobs of people were cheering the liberation of Baghdad and the toppling of Saddam's statue. You have to ask yourself, is it because of fear, or is it just routine self-censorship?
Self-censorship, is there self-censorship? That's a very different question from censorship by the government. Is there censorship from the government? No, there absolutely is not. I've never seen it. I've never heard of it. Any attempt to censor the free press in this country, I think, would produce an outcry from all journalists and from the American public, and I just think there's nothing like that.
The pressure comes from the ratings are not doing well. When the ratings don't do well, then sponsors don't want to pay as much money for each 30-second commercial anymore. And if the sponsors don't pay as much money anymore, then the Disney company doesn't earn as much anymore.
The great failures of the press in this country have been building for 25 years. They have to do with corporate economics. They have to do with a lack of diversity in the ownership of the press, not in the reporters.
The owners of the press set the tone for the reporters. You know, if the chairman of Viacom, whatever his name is, Mel Karmazin, wanted aggressive, challenging, controversial opposition journalism, he could get it if he wanted it. But the people working for Mel Karmazin don't think that's what he wants. They assume that's what he doesn't want. And we know over the years there's so many examples of reporters trying to go up against their bosses and being crushed. The owners decide what kind of journalism we get.
This question of ownership is really important because the values of a Walt Disney Corporation, or Viacom, or the other owners of so many huge media properties have very little to do with truth, but rather are driven by ratings, advertising, and popularity of the product. The bottom line for most of the corporations that own television networks, that own newspapers, that own magazines, and that own book publishers is no longer as it was when I went into the business when I was 16, some 44 years ago. The bottom line is no longer the best obtainable version of the truth. Not often enough. The bottom line is the bottom line. Good reporting, the best obtainable version of the truth, takes money. It takes a commitment to let your reporter spend 2 months on a story and come back and say, you know, it's not there.
Under capitalism, in the marketplace, all of these operations that we work for have to make a profit. And if they don't make a profit, they either go out of business or we go off the air.
American media are torn between the necessity of making a profit and the sincere intention of providing objective and courageous information.
We now see the brave journalists coming forward and asserting some independence. But where were they when it counted? I don't want to hear Ted Koppel read the names of dead American servicemen. I wanted Ted Koppel to behave responsibly before the war, challenging the Bush administration to demonstrate with substantive fact that basis for war, and when the Bush administration failed to do so, use his position on Nightline to tell the American people that we're going down the wrong path. Ted Koppel didn't do that. Ted Koppel failed. I don't want to hear Dan Rather talking about prison abuse.
A few days after Ted Koppel caused a fuss, Dan Rather, another icon of American TV, denounced on CBS the abuses in Abu Ghraib prison. The devastating impact of these horrible images on the American audience forced Bush to react immediately and to offer uneasy apologies to the Iraqi people.
People in Iraq must understand that I view those practices as abhorrent. They must also understand that what took place in that prison does not represent America that I know.
Dan Rather was particularly disgraceful before, during, and after the war. Just a cheerleader for power, a cheerleader for the administration. And even now, when he goes to redeem himself with the pictures of Abu Ghraib prison, he sits on the story for 2 weeks.
There was a 2-week delay, and actually it was, you know, the administration did call, the Pentagon did call, and was talking to the people at 60 Minutes and to Dan Rather, and saying that there might be, if these were released, there's a possibility that it could put some of our people in danger. We had a hostage at the time, and they pleaded with us to hold it till they saw where they were with that hostage and to convince us that, you know, our soldiers might be at risk. But there was only a certain amount of time. We agreed to do it, but we, from the beginning, said we can't hold this indefinitely.
Nobody's called him on this because the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff asks him to sit on the story and then says, we only broke the story because we had to. It was going to come out on the internet anyway. We didn't break the story because we should or because it's the right thing to do for the American people or for the world. We broke the story because somebody else was going to break it. It was going to come out on the internet. I mean, this is cowardice, just utter cowardice on his part.
It's easy for Dan Rather and Ted Koppel and others now to assert, you know, their journalistic privilege in questioning the president. Where were they when it counted? And I'll tell you where they were. They were in the pocket of the White House.
The awakening of the main TV networks was spectacular. The main American newspapers followed and apologized for their lack of courage and objectivity in their coverage of the Iraqi war through virulent, if not sincere, mea culpa.
I think it's important to remember that despite what the press tells you, the press is almost always reactive, that the press will wave the flag as long as everyone else waves the flag.
And when public opinion turns against the war, well, at least they follow. They don't defend the war. They follow public opinion. In Vietnam, the press did its job correctly toward the end because American opinion turned against the war.
What will happen in Iraq is that the coverage will get a lot better once Americans start asking, and I think they are beginning, to ask the kinds of questions that the press should have asked before this thing began.
Well, you've seen the implications. You've seen the result. We're now embroiled in a disaster in Iraq, an absolute unmitigated disaster with thousands of people getting killed for no good reason.
And I don't think Americans yet have a clear view of how hated we are, not only in Iraq, but throughout the Middle East, and increasingly throughout the globe. And I don't think they have a clear understanding that in many ways we deserve to be hated.
Well, you can't ask the dead what they think. Are they better off than they were before the Americans came? I mean, it's insane. And that's the implication. That's the result of an uninformed, passive press.
American journalists are stuck between friendly pressures of the current administration, demands from the audience, and huge ideological pressure coming from their corporate owners. Again, American journalists will probably find themselves in the uncomfortable position of the crocodile on a visit to the tannery.